Hello. Thank you for joining us for our pre-concert conversation for our next Sound Waves program. I'm Ed Parsons, General Manager of the Florida Orchestra. Always a pleasure to have with us our music director, Michael Francis.
Hello, welcome to this fantastic concert. Really exciting, very inspiring, and most uplifting.
So while our string players are doing our Masterworks program, we have our winds, brass, and percussion hard at work with our very interesting program featuring a diverse group of American composers. And the first of those is Adolphus Hailstork, and we have his American Fanfare. Adolphus Hailstork is an African-American composer born in 1941. He's primarily known for his sacred and choral music, stemming from his time singing as a boy in the choir of an Episcopal church. He served in the U.S. Armed Forces from 1966 until 1968, and he describes his music as always lyrical, tonal, narrative, dramatic, and propulsive. He didn't subscribe to the school of music, this more avant-garde kind of music in the 1960s, because he said a lot of that music just didn't sing for me. And this piece is a sort of homage to the piece we end our concert with, the Fanfare for the Common Man, but this has a bit of a bluesier kind of feel.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So the way this concert is designed is we're taking maybe the most iconic of American pieces, the Fanfare for the Common Man by Copland, written in the height of the Second World War. And this piece that has inspired not just many other fanfares, but indeed an American musical language. So identifiably, so quintessentially American. As soon as you hear those open fourths and fifths, you know exactly where it is. So I thought I'd create a concert where we have the variations before the theme. And Adolphus Hailstork's American Fanfare was written as a fanfare to open an art gallery in Richmond, Virginia. And this is what fanfares, what's so interesting about fanfares, is that they're so ancient, they're used for so many different ways. So, for example, there's always the heralding of the royalty, and indeed in medieval times in Great Britain, for sure, the kings and queens would have as many trumpeters as they could, for the greater the noise, the more important they were. And it's, of course, been used to herald the beginning of war signals, and now, in the 20th century, it's used for a greater variety of reasons. And actually, the fanfare goes back such a long way. I think they found trumpets in Tutankhamun's tomb, some 1500 years BC, in China, also around the same time in Scandinavia. This is one of the most ancient and primal of human forms of communication and expression.
And our next fanfare is by Joan Tower. It's the Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman, number 1. Joan Tower wrote 6 fanfares of this title over the course of 22 years, this one coming from her first in 1986. And it is clearly inspired by Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man and uses the same instrumentation. It was commissioned by the Houston Symphony and dedicated generally to women who take risks and who are adventurous, and specifically to the renowned conductor Marin Alsop, who definitely fits that description.
Yes, Marin has been an absolute trailblazer for female conductors in her years and done a wonderful job. I've played with her many times in the London Symphony Orchestra before I became a conductor. And Joan Tower has been a true pioneer for female composers, particularly in America, but also internationally. And this piece is quite different to the Copland's. Copland's is a fanfare for the common man. It's rather simple in its style and form. It's not flashy, it's not flamboyant, it's not particularly virtuosic. Whereas the Joan Tower is very virtuosic, full of outrageous moments, particularly for the timpani and also for the trumpets. Very, very adventurous and very risk-taking, so exactly what she says. And again, a really brilliant way of encapsulating the variety in which the fanfare can be used.
Then we come to the core of our program, which is Joseph Schwantner's Percussion Concerto. Joseph Schwantner is a Pulitzer Prize-winning American composer born in 1943. His music is generally quite modern, full of color and drama, and usually quite a bit of percussion. In fact, his Percussion Concerto is one of his most famous pieces, beloved by percussionists all over the world, and it was commissioned by the New York Philharmonic for its 150th anniversary in 1993. And to play it with us is our wonderful principal percussionist, John Shaw.
This piece is a brilliant example of the American musical language because it's pluralistic. What I mean by that is it takes many different styles and amalgamates them together. In fact, the instruments that he uses, the shekere, which is an African drum, We have the alpine cowbells, so often used in Mahler's music, as well as the great variety of traditional things that we're used to seeing, marimbas, bass drums. There's indeed a huge cadenza, which I haven't heard yet, which is improvised by the soloist, which really does feel like something out of a 1980s glam rock band with him punching away in a very heavy metal type fashion. So a real mixture of styles and colours and timbres going on. The first movement has these long repeated sections, which is unusual, but every time it repeats, he adds more and more layers. And also very hypnotic, there's these long ostinatos, which are repeated melodic and rhythmic themes that go on and on and on, but layering each time throughout. And in the second movement is rather touching. This was dedicated to his great friend Stephen Albert, who died during the composition of this piece. And it's far more subtle. And the soloist moves from being at the back of the orchestra to being at the front. And here we see the more Asian influence with a water gong, as well as other instruments you'll recognize. And there's a beautiful moment in which there's a slow chorale just grows through the orchestra, and you hear this low heartbeat on the bass drum, and it all builds up to this pulsating and incredibly exciting climax in the second movement before the music of the first movement comes back. And in the third movement, he takes this idea almost of minimalism, this repeated theme, this repeated rhythm that builds all the way up to this huge cadenza, which is a solo improvised passage I mentioned, and then the piece ends. This is fantastically colourful music. And of course, the thing about a percussion concerto, it's so visual. You have to see it. You have to see some of the things that are going on, just the amount of notes they play with these 4 sticks in 2 hands, and then just a variety of things going on, and a real tour de force for the orchestral percussion as well. This is a brilliant and flamboyant piece of music.
And if we want to learn more about those instruments, stick around to the end of the video when we have a video from John Shaw where he goes in depth in all of the various instruments in the piece. Next we have Stephen Stucky's Music for the Funeral of Queen Mary. Of course, we have all American composers, but with a British-American music director, we have to have a tinge of British music.
Just a little bit of seasoning.
That's right. So Stephen Stucky is an American composer born in 1948 and died tragically of brain cancer in 2016. His music for the funeral of Queen Mary was composed in 1992 at the request of Esa-Pekka Salonen for the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The work was inspired by the music of Henry Purcell. Of it, he wrote, "I used 3 pieces heard at the funeral of Mary II of England, who died of smallpox on December 28, 1694. A solemn march, the anthem In the Midst of Life We Are in Death, and a canzona in imitative polyphonic style. In working on the project, I did not try to achieve a pure musicological construction, but on the contrary, to regard Purcell's music, which I love so deeply, through the lens of the 300 intervening years."
So Purcell was Britain's greatest composer, probably until Edward Elgar. We have a huge, long gap in the middle, in fact, where, of course, England and Great Britain is more famous for its writers, for literature and for poetry, than it has been for composition, until Elgar, Benjamin Britten, and those in the 20th century. But Purcell's music was so powerful. He was a boy chorister in Westminster Abbey. He then always wrote for the royal court. And this music that you hear, you have to imagine that for Queen Mary II, she was a very pivotal figure. Her father, King James, was looking to bring Catholicism into the UK, and she was looking to keep Protestantism, which, of course, that was the defining moment, and fundamentally Great Britain has been Protestant ever since. So a very iconic figure. She died relatively young, as Ed mentioned, but it was a very powerful funeral. So for Purcell to be in Westminster Abbey, this great, huge tomb of a building, from a young age, those sights and smells, and then that pomp and circumstance of a regal funeral was so powerful. And the theme which he has at the very beginning is most recognizable. In fact, we have Brent Douglas, our pianist, just to play it for you now. Thank you, Brent. And that beautiful, subtle harmonic changes is then taken into an amazing epic way. There's the march, there's the anthem, then there's the canzona, and at the end of it, then the march comes back in full glory with an amazing timpani writing passage of music, and then the brass and the winds in full heraldic glory. This is stirring, uplifting music. And what Stephen Stucky has done so well is he takes one passage of music, the third bit in the piece, and he sort of diffuses it and brings it out of focus, and you start to hear some modern things coming through, but before bringing it back for the final blaze of glory.
And of course, we end with the most famous of pieces on our program, Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. It was premiered in 1943 and commissioned by the Cincinnati Symphony as part of a season-long commissioning project, an effort to arouse patriotic sentiment at the start of World War II. Copland took the title from Henry Wallace, Vice President of the United States during Roosevelt's third term, when Wallace dubbed the 20th century as the century of the common man. It was his way of honoring the common man, who he said, "After all, we're doing all of the dirty work in the war and in the army." The famous conductor Eugene Goossens was the one who commissioned it, and he wrote to Copland saying, "Its title is as interesting as the music, and I think it is so telling that it deserves a special occasion for its performance. If it is agreeable to you, we will premiere it on March the 12th, 1943, at income tax time." Said Copland, "I was all for honoring the common man at income tax time."
And actually that was a key point, because in 1942 the American government, the federal government, drew $3.8 billion, but by 1944, because of the war effort, they drew, or at least tried to draw, $20 billion, and only 1 in 7 people could pay their taxes, so this really was a big deal. And this was part of a commission of 18 fanfares, as Ed mentioned, and some of the titles of the other very famous composers like Darius Milhaud, William Grant Still wrote it, Howard Hanson, as well. There's fanfares for the merchant marines, fanfare for the medical corps, fanfare for paratroopers. So Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man really stood out, and of course it's probably the only one that we really remember of it. But the way that he writes it, so Copland was an arch modernist when he started writing music. He was born in 1900, but when he went to Paris and learnt, and in fact actually Adolphus Hailstork also studied with Nadia Boulanger as well. So this was a real modernist world. But then around the 1930s, he began to realize that the American people needed a language. He saw the social necessity of the artist to create a language to unite the people, and through his ballets like Rodeo, Billy the Kid, and of course Appalachian Spring, his most famous one, he created this sense of an American musical language. And the Fanfare for the Common Man is so iconic. It's so regal, so noble. I read that actually in the space stations, they're playing it as they look over Earth. It's this sense of it being something about the common good of man. And the music is very simple, not flashy, not flamboyant, very regal, very noble, extremely powerful. And the way that he took such care with it, it's a simple piece of music, but he took a long time writing it. And that really shows in just the skill, and to write things simply, like to cook something well and simple, of course, as we know, is very, very hard. This is the fanfare now moving away from being all about the royal personage or the onset of war to something else, that all of us deserve to be treasured, all of us deserve to be recognized, and I hope this concert will give you that sense of the occasion of the everyman. Look forward to seeing you there for what will be a spectacular sonic and visual feast for the eyes and ears.
Hope you could join us. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm John Shaw. I'm principal percussionist of the Florida Orchestra. I'm here in my studio at St. Petersburg College preparing the Joseph Schwantner Concerto for Percussion and Orchestra. It's got a lot of really interesting sounds in it, a lot of interesting percussion instruments, so I'm going to tell you about some of those right now. I'm going to be playing 2 setups, one in the front of the orchestra and one towards the back of the orchestra. The first and third movements I'll play in the back of the orchestra, and I'll be playing some instruments you've seen before, such as the xylophone and the marimba, and a whole series of drums. In this movement, the percussion is used rhythmically, but also as a means of color change. So the whole movement sounds very much like a kaleidoscope. Colors coming in and out, swells in the orchestra, and percussion takes us through that. The xylophone, of course, is an instrument you've probably seen before. How is it different from a marimba? It's tuned more brightly, it's got a higher range, and it has a more incisive cutting sound to it. But I also play marimba, which is the larger cousin to the xylophone. It has a much deeper range, a mellower sound. It's usually played with softer mallets. And this is a bulk of the melodic content in the first movement. So the marimba sounds like this. Also in the first movement and the last movement, there's a whole series of drums that I play. I've got a setup with a small concert bass drum on legs, several concert toms, some bongos. For the cadenza in the third movement, which is improvised, I also add some other sounds, some cowbells, a synthetic wood block, a pedal bass drum, some cymbals. And these provide a lot of rhythmic bursts in the first movement and the third movement. Another instrument I play is called a shekere, and this is a gourd with beads around it, and I basically throw it back and forth like a ball. And it's got a wonderful bass tone to it when I slap it with my palm. But you can also hear the beads, and so the shekere is played sort of like this. And I actually play that while I'm moving from the front setup in the orchestra back to the back of the orchestra for the third movement. The second movement of the Schwantner, I'm up front in front of the orchestra, and this utilizes a lot of ringing metals. This movement is a little bit more somber, more brooding. It's actually written in memoriam to a friend of Joseph Schwantner's. And we use a vibraphone, which I'm sure you've heard before, which sounds like this. Often I use that in conjunction with some crotales. Crotales are tuned metal discs. They're also called antique cymbals, but they're also tuned to specific pitches. And when you use the two together, it has quite a haunting quality to it. I'll also use some triangles, more ringing metal here. Schwantner also calls for a couple of different sized suspended cymbals, which have two different sounds. We get some different sounds out of these too by sometimes scraping them with a triangle beater, or possibly doing a little gliss around the edge of the cymbal. Another interesting item is using a small gong with a tub of water. So it's a water gong. You just dip it in out of the water and it changes the pitch. And we also have some tuned cowbells, also known as Almglocken. These are from Switzerland, and these are tuned to actual notes. And so I'll just play them with regular mallets, just like I would a vibraphone. Some drums are also used in the second movement, and they sort of represent a heartbeat. There's a lot of sonorous bass drum happening in which I'm playing this pattern. And I use the bass drum in conjunction with a field drum sometimes, and that creates a little high and low back and forth. times on the bass drum, I'll use some other sounds too. I'll use a ruto, which is a bunch of twigs, and a mallet on the edge of the shell of the bass drum. So I hope this gives you some insight into the instruments that I'm playing and a little bit about the sounds that you're going to hear. Hope you enjoy the piece.